Hey, I'm Catriona Starpins, and today we are going to be bezeling a cabochon. So let's take a look at my bead mat and see what we need to use. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the things in my beading kit that I use for all of my projects. The first thing is a beading needle. You can see here I have this beading needle that I've been using a little bit. It is a straw needle in a size 11 made by John James, and you get 25 in there. So they're quite good value. I like that they bend. They're a little bit shorter than a regular beading needle, and they go through most beads. I don't have to switch down to a thinner needle very often. My thread of choice when I'm doing bead embroidery is the Fireline. I'm using the 6-pound, 125-yard smoke, and I tend to sway towards the smoke. The smoke does have a little bit of graphite that comes off on your fingers when you're working sometimes. I don't mind that. Some people don't like that they get a bit of grey or black on their hands. Completely up to you. It does come in a crystal white colour as well. If you don't like the graphite, you can go with the crystal. I don't like that the white shows within dark beads, whereas the smoke I just find works for pretty much everything, except if you're using white or transparent, then I would switch to the crystal. The other good thing is it shows up really well on filming, so you'll be able to see what I'm doing today. So I'm going to stick with that. So that's the thread and the needles. This is super handy little tri-scoop. They're about 70 cents, and they're super useful for scooping your beads off your mat to pour them back into whether they came out of a packet or a tube. So I can't live without my triangle. I also use a thimble and a little protector for my hand. You can see the smoke fire lines rubbed off on that a bit. It protects the crease in my finger here when I'm pulling my thread in the motion of sewing. I find that it rests in the little crease in my finger, and if I pull too tight, it can actually cut. So I don't want that to happen, so I just wear that to protect. I do have another video on how to make one of these for yourself if you find that you've got one of your fingers that is getting worn down by your thread at any stage. I will link that down below if you want to take a look at that. The things that I use, I have my trusty Thread Zap thread burner. These are made by the Beadsmith, and I absolutely love it. I use it for so many different things when I'm doing my bead embroidery, and I have had two of these. One is out in my lounge room beading, and one is here in the studio, and I cannot do without it. I just love it. The other thing I have is some E6000 glue. I'm going to use that to stick down our cabochon today, and my trusty lighter, which I use to make these little knots on the end. I'll just quickly snip this one off, and you can see I just burn a little knot with my lighter. So that's a handy little trick if you don't like tying knots. Super fast, and I find it just as effective as if you've tied a knot in your thread. So obviously a nice sharp pair of scissors. These ones are super handy. These are fishing scissors. They've got a little serrated edge on them and a little nook for cutting wire or through cup chain if you're using that. I love these. Obviously needles and thimbles and all these, accessories for your beading are going to be completely optional, and also they may work for you, they may not work for you. This is just what works for me, and this is what I love to use. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, I'm going to bead around this cabochon today. This is a Par Puca cabochon, and I've purchased mine from Cranberry. It's a 25mm one, and it's in the check silky silver finish. So it's so beautiful, such a lovely silver sheen. These are really precision, excellent quality cabochons. If you want something that is perfect every time, the pucker cabs are just beautiful. So I'm going to use a piece of lacy stiff stuff. Now this is a little bit like a piece of interfacing. It's quite stiff, as the name says, and I'm going to stick my cabochon down into the center of this piece. I'm going to use E6000 glue, and I use the little tubes because it dries out super fast, and I want to make sure that I get the most out of my glue. So I very rarely buy the big tubes of E6000 anymore. I'd prefer to buy, 5 or 6 little tubes and do it that way. I am going to make a nice even coating, but a good amount of glue to adhere this cabochon onto this piece of stiff stuff. Some people use Palin or interfacing. I work at a bead shop. We sell lacy stiff stuff. It works perfectly for me. So you can see I put a nice even coating, and now I'm putting quite a firm pressure onto that cabochon to stick that down into the center. I want to make sure that it's adhered all the way around. I don't want to stitch through that glue, so you can get something out like an awl, but I also really like the corner of my triangle just to wipe away any oozed residue. Now, ideally, you want to leave this cabochon to set, half an hour to an hour it's enough, just so that that has stuck down and set to that stiff stuff. I've done classes before where we've sewn straight away, and it's super frustrating for a beginner if the glue has not dried. So take the time to let the glue dry, and we will come back once that dried and we will get started to bezel around. Okay, so now that my cabochon has dried onto the stiff stuff, I can begin to do my stitches around the outside. I tend to use a 4-bead backstitch, and with a round stone like this, you can start anywhere as long as it's up nice and close to the edge of your cabochon. So I'm going to bring my needle up, and I'm bringing it up so that it's right next to the edge of the cabochon. It's not under the edge, it's not out from the edge, but it's right exactly where the width of that cabochon finishes, and I'm going to bring my needle up. Now, what I like to do when I'm starting is just to do a couple of little stitches on the spot, and what this does is just ensures that the knot that I have done is going to be super strong and hold down when I'm beading. That's going to get completely covered with beads anyway, so it doesn't matter. So now we want to use some beads. We're going to be using some size 11 seed beads today, and I've picked out a purpley color. This is silver lined dark smoky amethyst AB, and the code is 111013. All right, so if we just put a few of these on the mat, you'll notice I'm not pouring out the whole tube at once. I'm just pouring out a few. I find it's much easier to use the beads when they're spread out like this, rather than piled up in a big pile. These nice soft fuzzy foam mats that I'm working on allows the beads, you can see the majority of those beads have landed with the hole facing up. So it's super easy for me to come in and pick up those beads with my needle. And you can see to do that, I'm just placing the tip of the needle onto the top of the bead and pressing down, and it's picking up those beads super easy. I've picked up 4 seed beads, and I'm laying them from where their thread started to where they lay down to. And the best thing for a beginner to do is just snug them up to that thread. So you can't see much of where it was. Snug it up like that. And now I'm going to place my needle right next to the cabochon and right next to where that bead comes down. So bring that back down through the stiff stuff, and those beads are sitting right up next to the cabochon there. You can see those beads are sitting right up next to the cabochon there, right where we want them. Now I do a 4-bead backstitch, so I add 4 beads and then I come back through 2. So I'm coming up in the middle of those 4 beads. My needle is right in the middle of those beads. It's not to one side of them. It's not to the outer side of them. It's right in the middle, almost where that thread would be coming between those beads. And then I'm going through 2 beads again, just like this, just the last 2. And what we're going to do is repeat that all the way around. So I'm going to pick up 4 beads initially, pull them down, lay them down next to the cabochon like that, bring my needle down through the foundation, right next to the cab, right next to the bead there, push it down, and now I'm bringing my needle up underneath, right next to the cab. You can see I'm pulling out right next to the cab in the middle of those beads. Oh, take another stab. And just go through those last 2 again. I prefer to add my beads 4 at a time and then go back through 2, because adding it in an even amount sets us up perfectly for the peyote bezel that we're doing today. So I'm going to be adding 4 beads at a time, going back through 2 all the way around. Pull the beads down, lay them next to the cab, pass down through the foundation, back up again through the last two again. So we're going to do this all the way around. We're going to see how this fits around our cabochon. And when we get to the other side, if we've got too many or too little, we'll talk about what to do next. Right now, I'm just going to continue that all the way around. Something I wanted to share with you is my bead embroidery journey began with a class with the Bead Society of Victoria. And it was a class that I did at one of their January bead retreats, summer bead retreat here in Melbourne. And it was with one of our members of the Bead Society, Ruth Davies. And it was such a lovely class. It was so relaxing. And it was my first introduction to bead embroidery and stitching on foundation like this. And I have never looked back. I can't thank Ruth enough for her fabulous tuition. And it really spurred me to learn more about the beads and discover new ways of how I could incorporate these tiny little glass wonders into my work. And yeah, it just was the best thing ever. Before that, I was doing lots of stringing, lots of bead weaving, peyote stitch, herringbone stitch, and I was really loving it. Don't get me wrong. But this form of stitching through the foundation really began my journey with bead embroidery. And I just love it. So I really wanted to be able to share with all of you, I guess, where my journey began. And that was learning how to bezel around a cabochon, just a simple project to begin with. And I really hope that that brings everyone out there who shows an interest in beading the skills that you need to get started. I want to encourage people to have a go. The hardest part with beading any project is obviously getting started. So what's the worst that could happen? You could have a go. You could have a great time. You could get frustrated, but learn something in the process. To me, that's a win-win. And don't be too hard on yourself because, you know, the first time we make something, it's never going to be perfect the first time. I'm a bit of a perfectionist myself, and I'm probably my worst critic when it comes to my beadwork. And I really feel that, yeah, the hardest bit is just getting started, and just making things is just so rewarding. I find it so enjoyable. It's like a little bit of meditation. It calms me down. And ultimately, it just makes me happy to be able to make something myself with my own hands and to be able to share with others as well. Like teaching you today how to do this brings me great joy. So I'm just going to try and do more and more of this and bring more lessons to you as much as I can. A little bit of background for you while we're beading here is I have two young children. I have Lucas, who is now 10 years old, and I have Chloe, who is 7. So I'm a very busy mum, and I don't always have time to stop and bead. But you know what? When I do, I always just feel so much better. So do make the time to do something that you love and have fun with it. All right. I've gone all the way around while I've yabbered at you, and I have come to a gap here where I think only 2 beads are going to fit. If you have a gap where you might only fit 1 bead, leave that gap. It will close up when you do your peyote stitch, rather than adding an odd amount of beads and then you can't do your peyote bezel. The other thing you can do is you could, if the gap is really too obvious here and you think it's going to show, you can go back, you know, the last 8 beads, pull those last couple of rounds out and just space them a little bit more. You can see I can test 2 beads here. 2 beads is going to fit into that gap beautifully. It just comes with experience over time. The thing to remember is you are much better if your beads are bunching, you are much better to take those out and have less in the overall round as long as it's an even amount, but you don't want to have too many beads and too much bunching because it's not going to sit nicely on the cabochon. I put 2 beads in that gap and I'm going to go through 1 bead instead of going through 2. So I've just halved the amount I've added. Now you can see I'm just heading now around all of these beads. Now I don't want to pull this row too tight because then it makes it hard to do my first row of peyote stitch. But this row of beads really just helps that first row to be even around your cab, just pulls them in a little bit towards the cab. You can see I am just threading my needle through those beads all the way around until I get to where I started, just to pull the beads right in. I've got to the end there. I've headed down through the foundation, showing you that I've gone all the way around, and it's looking great. I'm very happy with how it's come. Okay, so I'm going to start by coming back up through the foundation through one of these beads in the initial row. And this sets us up for the start of our peyote stitch. Now, for those of you that haven't done peyote stitch before, we're going to be setting a bead above the next bead available. So I'm coming out of this one here. I'm going to go over that one and into the next. And what this does is it sets this little bead up on top of that bead that we skipped. Now I'm going to pick up another bead. I'm coming out of this one here. I'm going to skip that one and go through the next. So you can see now I've got 2 beads that are just sitting up on top of the bead previously. Let's do that again. Coming out of this bead, skip that one, go through the next. If you find when you're picking up your beads that you find there's a bit of an irregular shape to your bead, or you think it's wider than the last, and you know, it's okay to discard a bead occasionally if you find that it's not going to work. I'm not too picky with these ones. These are Miyuki. Very rarely do I find one of these is going to be not helpful in my cause. But if I do find a bead, you know, you can see some of them are perhaps very slight. I don't know, bigger than the other. It doesn't matter so much with these. You notice them sometimes with other brands of beads or cheaper beads from $2 shops. They are very misshapen and not fit for purpose with this. So if you've bought your beads, you know, cheap and cheerful at the $2 shop, or I believe they call them a dollar store in some countries, and you find that they're all misshapen, you know what? Invest in some beautiful Japanese seed beads. You will thank yourself later. They're much more even, much more beautiful. Even the check seed beads are really lovely to work with. I love a check size 11, size 8. They're really nice, uniform beads, and they give you a much better result when you're doing your peyote stitch. Okay, so you can see I'm ending up with 1 up bead and 1 down bead all the way around. And this is the hardest row of peyote stitch, simply because it's tricky to get your needle in between those 2 beads of where you want to be. I'm coming out of that one, I'm skipping this one, I'm going through the next. I sort of have to dig my needle in between the 2 and lever it into there with the needle. And then I pushed the foundation out the way to get that through. So it's a bit of, you got to hold your mouth right until you get used to how that's going to work for you. You can see there, I just sort of levered it up and passed my needle through. With these pucker cabs too, just be really careful the coatings. They are super beautiful colors. If you do have a coated cabochon like this one is, try not to scratch your needle into it because those needle marks, they are going to show later down the track. I'm being super careful that the tip of my needle is not scratching the surface of this cabochon at all. Okay. All right, so I am just going to finish the peyote all the way around, and when I get to the end of the row here, I'm going to show you a step up. You see my needle then just came off the end of my thread. A little trick I use sometimes when my thread is getting short is I can just tie a little single overhand knot like that at the end of my thread, and I'll get a little bit further along my file line, get more bang for my buck before my thread is too short and I need to change. If I was bead weaving and not stitching through a surface, then I certainly could join in a new thread with the file line. You can join the two ends together. Just continuing to peyote stitch along this row until I get to the end here. And what I wanted to show you was when I get to the step up, what I'm actually going to do. So I've just got a couple more beads here, doing my last couple of peyote stitches. Now I've gone all the way around and my thread is coming out of this bead down here in the back row. What I want to do is just follow stepping up into this first bead that we added when we started the peyote in this round. This is called a step up with peyote, and what this does is it sets you up for being up into the next row of peyote. So you can see all the way around. Now they're not sitting, you know, perfect. Some of them are sitting a little bit out, and this is traditionally exactly what peyote stitch does in that first row. So what I'm going to do now is do the second row, and because we now have a bead sitting prominent in it, rather than finding it hard to know which bead we're skipping over, we are skipping over this bead, but we just go through the next up bead because it's already up and easy to see. So from now on, after that first row, it's very easy for me to see, pick up a bead, pass through the next up bead. And we're going to do this all the way around. Picking up a bead, pass through the next bead. I just love this. I don't know why this makes me so happy, but it does. It's an enjoyable process. And oh, got my needle caught then. If you like repetition in a art and craft form, my bead art definitely brings me joy from repetition and satisfaction of completing a row. If I was using Delica beads, which are also made by Mayuki for this, sometimes you hear a little click as the bead hits into position when you're doing peyote stitch, more with a flat peyote stitch piece. So satisfying to hear that little bead, that little piece of glass just kick into position with its friends. Got a little bit of fluff there, so I'm just going to remove that. And you'll see here that each stitch I do, I'm pulling quite firm on that thread, and that pulls those beads up tight so they are cinching in around the cabochon. Now, once we've finished this row of size 11 seed beads, we are going to switch down to a smaller seed bead because you can see we're building up a little wall on the outside of the cabochon. And if we just kept building it up with the one size bead, it would be a straight wall and it wouldn't curve in towards the cabochon. but we are working with a curved shape and a tapered edge on that cabochon. So we want to make sure that we switch down to the next size seed bead, and that's going to continue to form these little bezel walls around the shape of the cabochon. If I kept using size 11s, it would just keep coming up like this. You can see it's a really good height already for this basic bezel. And so now I'm just going to find some contrasting beads. Let me see what I've got. Okay, so I've just picked out from my stash, a matte opaque cobalt AB, which is also a Miyuki. I much prefer using a Miyuki seed bead, especially when cinching in a bezel. They are just a little bit skinnier than, your Toho or your Matsuno beads. So they just lend themselves better to cinching in a bezel. I've tried to pick out a bead that is still visible and a bit of a contrast to what we've already got here so that you can see what I'm doing. When I got to the end of the row before, you can see I stepped up into this first bead added in the previous round, and that sets me up for continuing my peyote stitch here. I'm going to pick up a bead, go through the next up bead. Pick up a bead, go through the next up bead. As you can see, I'm pulling that with each stitch that I do. It's pulling on here. Got my finger protected, so that's okay. But what that is doing is cinching in that bezel around the shape of that cabochon. And so pulling it up. And I'm going to do this all the way around. I really love too, you can see the contrast here. You've got a sheen of this gorgeous cab. You've got the matte beads with the shiny, and look at the way those shiny beads pop. And the contrast is really helping those matte beads to show. I love that effect with using two different finish of seed beads. And seed beads do come in lots of different finishes. That bead is not going over the eye of my needle. Did you see that happen? Let me show you that again. I've picked up a seed bead, and it will not pass over the eye of that needle. So what I would do with that one is just pop that aside for now and do another one, or I can switch down my needle to a smaller size. I'm lazy on this occasion and I'm playing thread tiggy, which is when I'm running out of thread. Will I have enough to go all the way around? So I'm not going to change on this occasion, but you certainly could. If you want to use that seed bead in this project, you certainly could just switch down your needle size and that would work. You don't want to force those. If you do ever feel tension heading through a bead, you don't want to force your needle through those beads because you're going to just snap a bead. And there's nothing worse than you getting towards the end of your bezel and you break a bead in your bezel. It's very upsetting and it means unpicking or, starting again. Again, see, trying to pull that through, it's not going to work. I've got a choice, either be lazy, pop that aside, grab another one that is going to work. And I'm not going to throw those beads out. There's nothing wrong with those beads. I just need to have a different needle to use them. All right, so you can see how that is sitting really nicely up against the cab. It's about halfway around now. You can see there's no gap underneath there. There is here until we come around with the 15s and pull that in. And, I think once we get all the way around, I think that's going to be enough for this cab. It's a good height. It's not covering too much of it. You can still see a bit of a dome at the top of it. I think that's going to be just perfect once we get all the way around. So I'm going to continue. Picking up a bead, passing through the next one. Definitely playing a bit of thread tiggy here. Want to try and get all the way around. And you know what? It's probably not going to make it. So why don't we show how you would join a thread? So I'm going to stop here. I'm not all the way around. I cannot make it all the way. I'm going to travel in the same direction. I'm exiting this one. I'm going to pass through this bead, and this bead. And by weaving through those, I'm heading back down into the foundation without anyone seeing my thread. So I'm just hiding that thread inside. I'm going to pass my needle down through the foundation to the back. Now you don't want to tie your knots on this side because we're going to be cutting that around. You want to tie them onto this side so that you don't, when we cut out later, you don't cut into your knots or lose any beads falling off. All right, I'm just doing a little half hitch knot here, which is where you go through the knot and pull it up tight. And I'm going to do that again. I'm going to take a bit of foundation. Oh, going to pull it up until I've just got a little loop there. I'm going to go through, pull it down. And then what I do is I just come through away from where I've tied those two knots, and I do a further knot with my thread burner. So I chop off the thread with the thread burner by just melting through, and that cuts it. And I've got about 1 centimeter of thread there. And I'm actually going to make that into a knot using my thread burner, starting right up here. And I'm just melting that down into position. And I tend to push on it once I have, just so it makes a really flat knot. There is no way that that file line is going to catch on anything or be able to come undone. I've got 2 knots there and a third melted secured knot. There is no way that's coming undone. Super happy with that. Now what I can do is, there's my knot, little overhand knot that I tied in there before. I can just melt that out of the eye of the needle. So I'm only throwing away a minimal amount of file line that I'm not using. I'm going to get another piece of file line. Another hot tip when threading your needle, make sure you don't have any melted blobs on the end. It's really hard to thread the melted blob through the needle. You'll see I did a nice clean cut with my scissors. I bring the piece of thread right down in the tip of my fingers, and I'm going to place the eye of the needle over the top of that little dot, and then your needle is thread. Let me show you that again. I can almost not see that little dot of thread, but just enough for me to place the eye over the top of it, and it's thread. Super simple. That by holding it down low in your fingers there with not a big piece like this, and not trying to thread the needle blindly out in the open, by holding it down close and firm, the thread's got nowhere to go. It's got no chance but to go through the eye of the needle. So that's a super hot tip for any of you that are having trouble threading. And you can either melt it with your lighter or melt a little knot with your thread burner. I do both, whichever is close to hand. Now I'm going to bring my knot up here on the back, press it down a bit, do a couple of little stitches on the back here. You notice I haven't gone anywhere towards the outer edge. I've just done a couple of little stitches. That just helps to secure that knot and add a little bit of tension when I'm starting off again. Now I want to be exiting probably this bead here and go through that last one again. So I'm going to come up diagonally where I need to be, which is this bead here. Come out right next to the cabochon. Now I'm passing up through, and if you can only go through 2 at a time or 1 bead at a time, do that. But I'm just making my way back up to that last bead that we added. Then I'm going to go down as if we've just added it, down through that bead. Now I'm ready to continue where we left off. So I'm going to pick up a bead, go through the next. So you can add a thread at any time. Lots of people have different ways of adding their thread. That's just how it works well for me. I find if you go back through those beads you last added, then the tension of this pulling in is still just as good as it was before I cut that thread. There's no issues with maintaining tension through work and being able to pull that bezel in. One of the things that new beaders find the trickiest is definitely tension, threading needles, and starting and finishing. Like starting a new thread when you first begin is pretty scary. So if you can just get over that, you know, follow those simple steps for adding in a thread, it's not as painful when you need to add one in. All right, we are nearly all the way around. I'm just adding in my last bead here into this gap, and you'll notice I'm going to go through that bead that I meant to, plus the first bead added previously, which is a size 15, and that is the step up, all in one step. Just gently pulling through, pulling that up, and look at that, we have a gorgeous peyote bezel. Come back soon and join me for part 2 of how to finish this bezel. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe.